what I'm going to do today is connected to camp in a funny kind of way. I was working on the 4 messages I did for camp, which had just a profound impact. And that's not me. That's the Holy Spirit kind of coming alongside. A lot of kids crying, a lot of kids getting really real with God, stuff like that. But in the process, I've been working on those 4 messages since about March, because you have to do them you have to prune the junk out of them, make them just hard hitting and straightforward, and sometimes goofy. So that took some while. But it turns out God's sneaky. God's sneaky. When you're preparing to say something to an audience like youth and stuff like that, you think, well, all I have to do is sort of package up the truth, make it youth, tasty, and you do stuff, which is really fun. We did skits in a lot of them. But in the process, God's sneaky, because what he does is he challenges you while you're doing it, and then you go someplace new in terms of what the word says as you're preparing for something else. You know this with VBS. You have stuff, you want to present to kids, but in the process, you change and you learn. You never really fully get your arms around the Word of God. So every time you go back to it for a purpose, VBS, youth camp or something like that, you come away changed again. That's sneaky. That's sneaky, because you never really get it. So what I'm going to give to you today is what God was doing to me as I was preparing one of these very youth-oriented things. It changed me tremendously, and I found it convicting in a way I've never been convicted before, because I'm doing this other simple thing, but then, whoa. So this is something I didn't teach the kids this week. This is something that God did to me as I did this. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going to give you what God did to me in a couple of other speeches that I did up there. I mean, just changed me remarkably. So hopefully you can kind of do that with me. In our series, I'm taking a break in and out using these, our series on the name of God, the names of God. And the last time we looked, we saw that God's like a diamond with many facets. And every one of these names of God is like looking at God from a different facet. It's a different strength. And what we don't realize is that all through the Bible, people get their names changed. It's not just God's name we look at, but the name of people, the name of God. These names mean something. They're not just family names. You're not, named after my grandfather, my dad's father. I never knew. He died when my dad was 13. And my dad did not have me before 13, just saying. So I never knew him. His name is Frederick. Well, Frederick doesn't mean anything. That's my middle name. Frederick doesn't mean anything. It's just Frederick. It's just a proper name. But in the Bible, names mean stuff, which is fun, because then when you see a name come along, you go, hey, I'm going to find out what that name means. That's why the names of God are so fascinating, because they always describe a new facet in our understanding of who God is. And the person who understands it in that context gives God a name. So if you actually start summing up the names of God, you start to get a picture of the facets of who God is. Names always communicate the character of the person. They're not just family names. They always carry, always. So we're actually going to do that for one of the characters in the Bible today. It was one of the ahas that came along as I was doing this. The other thing is that those names are given. I mean, you know that when we refer to Peter, you remember you refer to Peter in the New Testament, and sometimes he's called Cephas, right? Sometimes he's Simon. Sometimes he's Peter. Like, what's going on? Well, in different phases of his life, his name changes because he changes, right? So if we adopted new names when we changed, it would be quite an interesting thing to come in on Sunday morning and say, hi, and you go, and you use the wrong name. And they say, no, my name today is Faithful and Just. What? What happened this week? Well, let me tell you what happened this week. I'm going to change my name because that reflects what happened. Okay, so it's stuff like that. That's what I'm talking about. So what we're going to look at is one of the most famous events in the New Testament, Paul on the road to Damascus. And during this week up at Big Canyon, that's the name of the camp up there, we were looking at different ways in which we undersell who God is. And, we don't really, you look at Jesus as a Sunday school fictional character, not really someone who is powerful and out of this world, literally speaking. So we were looking at Paul and how he got interrupted on the road to Damascus. You know this story. I know this story. I taught it there this week. I mean, you think, I got this down. Why should I read this again? Well, because you haven't squeezed it dry yet. So let's look at that. So let me just read it for you first, and then we're going to do a lot of contemplation on this, because this is big stuff. So I'm reading out of Acts 9, and this is where the account first shows up. Paul himself tells his own story later in Acts twice. So you can read those as well. But this is the first account in Acts 9. But Saul, his name was not Paul at this point. His name's not Paul until chapter 13 of Acts. And we're in chapter 9. So now he's still known as Saul, which, by the way, we talked about the fact that names mean something, right? Well, Saul was the first king of Israel, right? So when the people in Israel said, we want a king, they looked around and they said, how about that guy over there? Now, Saul in the Old Testament, Saul was, it says in, I forget the chapter now. I think it's 13, 1 Samuel 13. You have to go check me on that. But when you first see Saul and people are clamoring to have a king, they look at this guy and it says in the passage that he was handsome. No, not just handsome. He was more handsome than everybody in Israel. And he was also taller than everybody. And the way it's phrased is interesting. It says he was taller from the shoulders up than everyone else. Does that mean he has a long neck? No, it means everyone else only came up to his shoulders. So we would say, in our English vernacular, we'd say he's a head taller than everybody else, right? So that's what he was. So when you look at a crowd of people, there Saul's head would be sticking up, and a handsome head to boot, right? So, of course, when they say we want a king, they go, let's see, who should we pick? Ooh, he's good looking. Always a bad criteria for a king. He's good looking. Nah, it's just not this. And sure enough, after the decades that he reigns, he didn't do a great job. He did a little bit, but it wasn't a great deal. So anyway, Saul. So Saul, in the biblical context, even in the first century, Saul was a powerful name of the first king of Israel. He still had good cred. So it turns out that our apostle Paul was originally named Saul in order to kind of glean some of that glory of Saul, right? This is the first. I'm named after the king of Israel, the first king of Israel. And not only that, it turns out that Saul, the king, was from the tribe of Benjamin, kind of a small tribe. In terms of the line of the 12 sons of Jacob, you start with Reuben, and the last one, the 12th one, is Benjamin. So he's like the little kid brother in all of the tribes of Israel. So it's kind of a nice thing that the first king of Israel, Saul, or if you say it actually in Hebrew, I love saying his name in Hebrew, it's Shaul. Shaul. Yeah. So the first king of Israel not only was handsome, tall, right? But he also came from a diminutive, kind of smaller tribe. The youngest, the beloved son of Jacob was Benjamin. And then the next older brother, who is Joseph, right? So you got Joseph and, okay. So it's there's sort of a street cred that the name Saul has. It's from Benjamin, which was the beloved youngest son of Jacob, a little diminutive. So I come from small kind of backgrounds. Also the king, Shaul. And it turns out, you know what Saul, you know what that means, right? Are you doing this? We got to find out what names mean. Shaul means desired. Because the people looked at him and said, there's a good looking one. We desire him. So they named him the desired one. Shaul, Saul, desired one. So when Paul the apostle is born with that name, he's born with this instant cred that this is an up and coming guy who's like the first king of Israel, and he's desired, and he was well educated. He came out of Cilicia. He came of Tarsus up there, which is kind of like an academic town, sort of like Boston is today. I mean, he's got credentials. Paul has credentials, so they named him Saul. And in the street language, in Aramaic/Hebrew, he probably was called Shaul. And everyone would say, oh, look at that Shaul. He's so desired. What a great guy he is. This is Paul. And so when you see him in this context, you can smell the pride. He's got the right name, comes from the right family, comes from the right university. He's a man of great accomplishment. He's a golden boy. He's going somewhere in the community. So that's Saul. So that's what a detour that was. Okay, Acts 9, verse 9. But Saul was still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, 200 stinking miles away in present-day Syria, Damascus. So he asked for letters from the big religious toots in Jerusalem. For what? Well, he asked that what he could do, ask for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found anyone belonging to the way, that was the catchphrase for people following Jesus, men or women, it says, men or women, that he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So here's what he's doing. He's a bounty hunter for the religious elite. He's Mr. Golden Boy. He's a Shaul type. He's very accomplished, and he's very ambitious. So he gets letters from the religious guys in town in Jerusalem and says, look, if you write me a letter, write this letter to the synagogues, those are the meeting places, in Damascus, okay? And write it to the synagogues. And what do you think was written on those letters? We don't know. But it was probably something like an introduction to who this Saul was. He'd go to the rabbi who ran that synagogue, and he'd say, I'm from Jerusalem. And I just have this letter from the biggest toots in Jerusalem. And I want you to tell me, is there anyone in your synagogue who's following that false god, Jesus? Is there anyone who's kind of left your synagogue because they want to follow this Jesus? By the way, this Jesus guy, he's a total fraud. He is not the Messiah. And let me tell you why I know he's not the Messiah. So this is what Paul was doing. This is what Saul was doing. He'd go to the synagogues, ask the synagogues to rat on the people who were following Jesus. And then Saul would put them in handcuffs and take them back to Jerusalem, many times to be killed. So this is Saul the bounty hunter. This is Saul the bounty hunter. And he's going out to this entire thing. Very proud, very ambitious. He's going to do this. Now, prior to this in the story, we get another character pit on who Saul is. When Stephen, the very godly man who was stoned to death early in the book of Acts, when he's stoned to death, it turns out that they took their outer clothing off, their coats off, and they usually lay them in a pile before they do this sweaty work of throwing rocks at somebody. And it says in early part of Acts, it says that the guy who was guarding the cloaks was a guy named Saul. And he himself says this later on when Paul gives his entire story later on in Acts. In other contexts, is, yeah, that was me. So what it did is he said he approved of the killing that was going down. So this is ambitious Shaul, golden boy, righteous. This is Saul, the bounty hunter for the religion. Now, it turns out that he was quite authentically serious about Jesus being a fraud. Because at the time, the religious leaders at the time would look at Jesus and they'd say, no, you can't talk like you're the Messiah because you're not the Messiah. If you were the Messiah, we have a list, comes out of the Old Testament, and you're not doing the list. So don't you act like you're the Messiah because you're not doing the list. Like what? Well, like having mighty power and pushing out all the bad guys who are doing injustice to our people. You need to push the bad guys out. Who? Rome. And you're not, and in fact, your Jesus, who you claim is the Messiah, did he kick Rome out like it says in the Old Testament the Messiah is going to have power to do? Did he do that? Well, no. Well, there you go. He's a fraud. So Saul was quite ambitious and quite sure of himself that Jesus was not the Messiah. Now we know from what Jesus said in other places, including the Old Testament, that the Messiah comes twice. So the requirements that hung up Saul and everyone else about not having the power to push out Rome, that was something that everyone believed, but he's coming twice. He's doing that second part on the second trip. There's actually, when you look through the Old Testament and you catalog all the mentions about the Messiah, the anointed one, the one chosen by God to do this, when you look at all those, the reference is clearly split into two sides. You have a suffering Messiah and you have a powerful kingly Messiah. They're very clearly split. You can see it easily. But at the time, the Jews didn't want to listen to the suffering Messiah. They wanted the power Messiah. So Paul, was convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus was an imposter. And so in order to cleanse the Jewish community, he had to make sure that all those people who got sucked away by this imposter were put in jail because there's no way you can actually change their minds. Put them in jail so they don't contaminate the mix. It's actually collecting the yeast so it doesn't contaminate the dough. That's what he was doing. So he goes off and he pulls people from Damascus back to Jerusalem. Now, as he went on his way, you know the story, right? Dun, dun, dun. As he was on his way to Damascus, again, 200 miles. It's at least 10 days of walking. He's on his way to Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, and you are, well, that's my vernacular. He says, and who are you, Lord? Who are you? You're persecuting me. And he said, I'm Jesus. Oops. I'm Jesus whom you are persecuting. But rise, enter the city, Damascus, and you'll be told what you're to do. What? So all this time he's convinced, and he's on he's on a warfare path to get anybody who believes in Jesus, because Jesus is an imposter until Jesus speaks to him from the sky. And then in a heartbeat, he realizes he's wrong. In a heartbeat. Because come on, when someone from heaven stops you on your tracks and you follow the ground with a bright light and you hear this voice, stop persecuting me, and the voice says, I'm Jesus, it's like, well, okay, I guess I was wrong. But it wasn't that easy for Saul to say he was just wrong. And we're going to come back to that in a second, because we're going to go through what he was probably wrestling with. We do know, as an aside, as a preview of that, it took him years to get his head straight. Years. Which makes sense, because he'd already spent years studying the Old Testament, studying about the Messiah, and somehow he had to integrate an entire lifetime of study about who this Messiah was to put Jesus back in the front rather than him being an imposter. So it took him years to get over it. So he is there on the road to Damascus. So the men that were traveling with him, it says, stood speechless. They heard the voice, but they didn't see anybody. They heard a voice, didn't see anybody. In another passage, when he talks about they didn't understand what was being said either, they just heard a noise in a way. But this is more telling. Verse 8, Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So presumably he closed his eyes on the bright light. You see bright lights, you close your eyes. And then when you open your eyes, he saw nothing. He's blind. So there's some irony there. He saw nothing. So they led him by the hand, brought him into Damascus, and for 3 days he was without sight. He neither ate nor drank. That's how disturbing this whole thing was. And it would be that disturbing to you as well. It would be horrible. Just to kind of finish out the story a little bit before we go back and look at stuff. Now, there was a disciple at Damascus by the name of Ananias. And the Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias, and he goes on, and he tells Ananias, there's this guy who's going to be coming to you. His name's Saul. And when he comes to you, you need to tell him this. And God tells Ananias what to tell Saul. That's why God says, you're going to go into Damascus and I'll tell you what to do. Well, that's going to come through Ananias. Of course, if you read the passage, I'm skimming over it real quick. Ananias, when God first comes to him and says, you need to talk to this Saul guy. Ananias says, oh, wait, Saul? You mean the Saul, the guy who's arresting people? You can read this in Acts 9. And he resists God and says, I don't. And then God tells Ananias, you don't understand. You don't understand. He's my chosen instrument. What? You mean the guy who's persecuting the church? He's your chosen instrument? How's that happen? He tells Ananias. Saul shows up. Ananias finally comes to Saul while he's sitting there 3 days. He doesn't eat. He doesn't drink. He can't see. And Ananias comes to Saul and says, look, here's your future. And if I skip to the end in chapter 9, verse 15, and the Lord said to Ananias, go to Saul. He is a chosen instrument to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. You mean the guy who's persecuting Jesus is going to actually have a chance to talk about who Jesus is in front of kings? Read Acts. He does. In front of kings, in front of Gentiles. I thought Gentiles were dogs. That was the verbatim. That's what they would call Gentiles. Gentiles, dogs. They weren't even human beings. This Jesus is going to tell Paul that he is going to have a ministry to the Gentiles. But now we're scrambling our brains. Isn't Jesus the King of the Jews? How can he have a ministry to the Gentiles? Well, and because we're well-versed in the Bible, we know. Because the promise of salvation doesn't just stay with Israel. It goes to anyone who exercises the faith of Abraham, which opens the whole thing up to Gentiles. That actually is the biggest hurdle Paul has to get over, is how is it that the Jews, who are a chosen people, can be joined by the Gentiles, who are dogs? How can they be joined together? What's the basis of salvation? And if you've read Romans or Corinthians or anything Paul writes, he's very clear. You don't get salvation, you don't get life with God because you have an ethnic background, Jewish. Everyone, Jewish and Gentile, have a life with God in the future because of faith, because of Father Abraham, who exercised faith. So a real child of God, a real child of Abraham, is someone who actually exhibits the same faith as Abraham, including the Jews. So it's possible for the Jews who are ethnically Jewish to not make it to salvation because they don't have faith. Now, if you read the Old Testament, you find that happens a lot. You find that a lot. In fact, he says, I'm not really that concerned about how well you all are doing in terms of circumcision, but what you need to do, God says, is you need to circumcise your hearts. You got an inside problem. And now we're getting closer to the issue of faith that saves you. So he says, go and tell him this. And then the last thing Ananias says to him that God tells him is, says, you need to tell him this. I'll show Saul how much he must suffer for my name, for the sake of my name. I'll show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. Welcome to the believing community, Saul. By the way, man, are you going to have a hard life from here on out? What? Welcome to salvation. Well, so this is why it's messing with Paul's mind for quite some time. Not only just here, but years. This happens in chapter 9 of Acts. Paul doesn't really get up on his feet and do anything until 4 chapters later. In fact, he's gone. He's gone from chapter 9 until chapter 13. He's just not there anymore. He's off somewhere trying to get his head straight. And finally, Barnabas, who's a wonderful man, a son of encouragement. Barnabas is called to go out and do a first kind of tour into Turkey. And he says, you know what, we need Saul, now Paul, to come with us. And that's in chapter 13. Okay, so now you know the story. You know the story really well. So here's what I want to ask you, and this is actually on your song sheet on the back right corner, bottom right corner, is I want to ask you, because this is what God asked me as I was studying this very familiar passage. Am I good with interruptions? Are you good with interruptions? What if those interruptions come from God? Because this is like a classic case of interruptions. Paul's on his way. He knows what he's doing. He's righteous. He's just. He's arresting people so they don't contaminate the Jewish group of people. So he's doing the right thing. But he was totally wrong. So God had to interrupt him. Stop. Interrupt him. And this is what I've been thinking about for a couple months. Because you may know this about me. I am not very interruptible. If you can find me, you can interrupt me. But interruptions get in your way if you have plans to do something, right? If you're doing something and you're on a task and you're doing like that, you hate it when someone just comes along and says, "Hey, you got some time to kill? I just want to talk for a little while about nothing." Well, I've got things to do. This is important stuff, and it's not just that. It's actually more so from God. When God stops you, and I'll tell you 2 stories at the end about where God interrupted me in almost as severe a way as this. But I asked myself, why am I interruptible? Let's say from God, not from people, but from God. Am I interruptible from God? Because what it speaks about is the fact that even though you have a plan for what you want to be doing and accomplishing, goals set, you're on your way in life, you're on your way someplace, and you got this thing set and you're going, what would your reaction be if God says, no, let's go another way? How about I got these plans and I'm doing them for you, God? I don't want to do this stuff. When you're interrupted by God, that's when God says, I want my will to be done, not yours, Jim. You go, this is sort of convicting. But God, I thought I was doing your will. And you could have asked Paul on the road to Damascus, are you doing God's will? Oh, yes. Ambitious, powerful. I'm arresting people 200 miles from Jerusalem. That's how good But he thought he was doing the right thing. He had to stop him. He had to interrupt him. Say no. So right here you have a battle that goes on in the mind of Saul. Battle going on. I thought what I was doing was right, but now God proves to me in an instant, because his voice comes from heaven, that what I'm doing is wrong. He was not very interruptible because he had set his path based on his plans and not God's plans. And this was the conviction I came to as I studied this since March. I'll just say I'm annoyed when God interrupts me. I'm annoyed because I'm like the Blues Brothers. We're on a mission from God, right? You're doing something for God. But what if he interrupts you? Well, then at that point, what he's saying is that, I think we need to talk. I think you're in the wrong direction. I think something's not right. But I don't like that because once I get my teeth into something like that, and I start marching in a certain direction, I'm going to do this until I get there. I'm very goal-oriented. But what if God steps in and says, no, I don't think so, Jim. Who are you? What's going on? I have found that if you classified yourself as interruptible, then you hold your plans more loosely when God changes them. So in the phases where I'm not interruptible by God, I'm not really open to be steered by God, nor am I expecting him to interrupt me. I've got a plan. I'm going to do it. I'm going to get to the end of the day, and then tomorrow I'm going to do this. And you make that whole stuff. Something about you and your life plan starts to take place over God's plan. Or I could say it this way. When you're not interruptible, then your pride elevates your plan for life over God's plan for you. In a real sense, you hear these words in the New Testament when Jesus is praying in the garden. He says, well, not my will be done, but your will be done. An interruptible person is someone who lives constantly with the idea of thy will be done, not mine. Who doesn't take your own personal plans for what you accomplished this week or what you're going to do for God or all those ideas, which can be stellar and righteous, like Paul thought his was. But if you live in a constant state where you say to yourself, I want God's will to be done today, not mine, then you're actually emotionally ready to be interrupted. If you don't include his will in what you're doing, or it's just not in the forefront of your thinking, you're not interruptible. So when God finally does step in, it's as dramatic as Paul on the road to Damascus. It's like, I'm doing the right stuff. So this is what I've been wrestling with for a couple months, is the fact that do I live in the constant state of being aware of the fact that God's will needs to be done, not my own. And that will be reflected in the moment with whether I consider myself interruptible by God. I want my heart to be interruptible by God. I want it to actually rise up in the morning and say, God, look, here's my plan for the day. I do this every day. Here's my plan. Let's do this. And then say, like Jesus said, but not my will, but yours. But this is the direction I'm going. So someone who's interruptible is someone who is more mindful of the will of God and expecting his will to interrupt than placing your plans above his. You see that? It's kind of an emotional humility about where I'm going and what I'm supposed to do. Now, I was thinking through a lot of interruptions I've had. We had a big interruption last week when Dorothy wrecked her wrist and arm, and I'd call that an interruption. And you know what? It happened at exactly the wrong time because I was busy getting ready to speak at a camp for a whole week. I don't have time to do this right now. God, what are you doing? That's the non-interruptible heart speaking. Instead of saying, now here's the flip side. If my heart was easily interruptible, I would have said, oh, I don't know, God, what you're doing, but I know that you allowed this to happen. I'll go with what your plan is. You see where you take your plans and you kind of put them under God's plans? And you can look at any situation and say, well, I wasn't expecting this. This is a great interruption in my life. But God's will needs to be preeminent, and I know that God's sovereign and he loves me. God's still in control. That doesn't mean he's not in control anymore. So I'll settle my heart in the fact that God's love is sovereign toward me. And even though this wasn't on my calendar for the week, God's loving me anyway. I'll go with what he plans. That's the compliant will of a person who doesn't complain when God gets in the way. Because when God gets in the way, that's by your definition. He gets in the way. What he's doing in the compliant heart that likes to be interrupted, or I just can deal with interruptions. What he's saying is, you need to start thinking like me. You need to be aware of the fact that I'm in charge here. It's my will, not yours. If it's your will, you're going to get ticked off at my interruptions. So a heart that's interruptible, and this is what I've used this definition for me all week. Am I interruptible? Am I willing to let God take over the next thing? In fact, more than that, am I willing to ask him to take over the next thing, even though I don't know what it is? See, that's a walk of faith. I don't walk by faith, but by sight, Paul says. So being interruptible is actually kind of a litmus test about whether I am preferring God's will over my own. And when the interruptions come, my emotional reaction tells me whether or not I actually was placing God's will above my own. See, being interruptible is something that I hate, but I realize that if I'm going to be following the Lord's leading, I need to be interruptible by God. Now, when you look at Paul, when you look at Saul, when he's on the road to Damascus, he could have reacted very poorly to this, right? He could have reacted really, really poorly. And this brings me to in the passage, I always ask 3 questions. And I don't ask obvious questions. When I read a passage, in order for me to understand it best, I want to ask 3 questions that are deep and insightful and come as a result of me chewing on this some. So one of the things I thought about as I was asking my 3 questions, one of my questions actually was, what's the necessary attitude of the heart for an interruption by God to not tick you off? What's the necessary character of your heart? Because when I think about Saul, he could have reacted very badly. And I mean, the light from heaven, the sound, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he could have raised his fist and said, I don't know who you are, and I don't care who you are, but I'm on a mission from God. You're probably some kind of demon or something like that. I'm on the path. I've got a plan. I've got people with me. That's what we're going to do. So get out of my way. Right? He could have done that. And in my understanding of who Saul was, that would be characteristic of his nature. He could have fought. Now, it's harder to fight like that. It's harder for the pride of your own plans and your own will to be there when you actually hear a voice from heaven saying, it's me, Jesus. And also when there's a blinding light. There's a blinding light. Now, that blinding light, many times people ask, why did God blind him for 3 days? It's like, what? Crazy. Well, because Saul, the intellectual elite who went to all the Hebrew schools for the Torah and for the Tanakh, the entire Old Testament, Saul, this very prideful intellectual guy who thought he had it all together, who thought he thought he knew everything about God and his plan for Israel. In fact, if you wanted to gain some insight, you'd go to Paul. Did you catch that sight thing? If you wanted insight into what the Old Testament says, what the Messiah is going to be, you would go to someone who has an idea. Go to insight. Paul was the guy that they went to as a reference for insight. And then God said, sight, Saul, you have got no sight at all. Bam, you're blind for a couple of days. Think about that. You have been blind all along. Blind all along. So the attitude of the heart is clear for Paul. He was humbled instantly. I mean, a voice from heaven will do that to you. And a blinding light, that'll do it to you. But somewhere that's not documented in that passage, he had to bend a little bit. His pride had to be trumped a little bit. He had to take his will and his agenda and put it under God's, because at that point on the Damascus Road, there was no avoiding it. There's no avoiding it. He had to go through a process of humiliation. You're not the man of great insight. You've been blind all these years. So blind, in fact, that when the Messiah came and made a guest visit in your town, you missed it. That's how humbling it is. So for us, when God comes and brings a interruption in our paths, so where's your heart at? Is it in this place of saying, God, I want what you want, not what I want? And I hadn't predicted this, and this seems to be kind of putting a wrench in the monkey works in terms of what my plans are. But God, I welcome this. I welcome this. Dorothy and I were talking this week about, do we welcome the fact that she completely, imploded her wrist and her radius and all that? I mean, just destroyed stuff in there. Can you actually say, well, God, thanks for this? No, it's an interruption that no one wants. It's painful. It's got so many ways in which it's bad. But we started realizing that in how it happened, there were interspersed all these blessings. Incredible blessings. And we talked some about these last week. She fell in the backyard. She wasn't standing on a sidewalk or the street where you hit the ground and you're hitting hard surfaces. She was standing on the lawn in our backyard, which you normally wouldn't think would bust your arm. But there it is. There it is. So she's on there. It could have been worse. Because she could have hit the ground, knocked her head, had a concussion if it was solid concrete or asphalt. But it was on grass. A soft fall, a big break. Okay, soft fall, we'll put that in the plus column, okay? Not only that, but she fell in shade. It was in the hundreds that day. So there's going to be a delay for me to get home and to get her. So was she going to lay in the hot sun at 100 plus degrees? No, she was in the shadiest part of our backyard. It's like, oh, this is okay. Plus side in terms of blessings, right? Another plus side in terms of blessings. I normally walk here midweek, and I had planned to walk into the office when that happened, which would have meant when she called me and I got back, it'd take me a half an hour to walk back home. Instead, for reasons I don't really quite understand, I took one of our cars and I drove here that day. I put that in the plus column. God's planning that kind of stuff. Not only that, when she's out working in the garden, doing stuff in the backyard, which she was doing, she normally leaves her phone someplace else, but she had it in her pocket. She never has it in her pocket. Now she does. Well, plus sign there, because she could call me instantly, and I actually answered my phone, which many of you know I don't do all the time. Sorry. I answered my phone. She says, I'm laying in the backyard. I'm pretty sure I broke my wrist. Right? So plus sign again. Recently, when she had surgery, it turns out she had surgery literally a week after the break. And if you've had orthopedic surgery, it takes longer than a week usually to get ready for it. It's usually 2 to 3 weeks. They splint you up or they cast you a little bit. They get you they hold you for a while, and then they say, okay, now we can do it. They had scheduled it to be less than a week after she broke. We put that in the plus column. Not only that, it was such an extreme break, a very complicated fix, that the doctor said, I need to noodle on this for a day. So can we put this off a day just so I can kind of get ready? Plus right there. So you can go down all pluses. One last plus set that we were working on is the fact that we have 2 major trips planned at the end of the summer. And so one of them's in early August, one of them's in September. And so, the question is, in the recovery of all this kind of stuff, how are those going to be affected? Well, when we planned out on the calendar how long you have to be in this stage after the fix, and then another stage after that where you start another, and you look at that, those don't interrupt any of our plans for the summer. They're exactly timed to be in windows where you don't have to go to the doctor. Well, okay. So there's plus signs. So there, when you look at the fact, it says, should I thank God for the fact that I just came through a horrible physical injury? Well, the injury is not something I would thank God for, but he allowed it. And in the process, we gained insight into how God had pre-planned all the steps in this for it to work out for his good. It's amazing. It is just totally amazing. And another interesting thing, too, is while I was up at campus last week, while it's going on, I had to leave town while she had her surgery, which I did not want to do. But for the sake of the youth that were up there, really precious youth, I shared that with the leadership from 6 different churches bring their youth groups up for the week that I was teaching at. And I shared it with them and said, I'm not totally here this week, although I'm speaking every night. I'm not totally here because my wife had this happen to her and she's having surgery today and even all this kind of stuff. They prayed for me all week long and asked about her all week long. It was a tremendous blessing. It's just a tremendous blessing. And a deeper response than I'd gotten from many of the leaders over these last 6 or 7 years, because there's a little distance between us, but we got real close. So, I can show you things that happen that are great. I don't thank God for catastrophe, but I do thank God for the fact that he walks with us through the catastrophe and he lines up healing and recovery. He's clearly there. So the attitude of the heart's an important one. That's the first question. What does your attitude have to be? Your attitude has to be on any interruption to first say, well, thanks God, because you're in control and you let this happen. So I know that you love me and you have a plan for my life. And I know that everything works together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. So I'll just put in that category, even though I'm clueless about what's next. Here's an interruption, Jim. Boom! Well, God, I wasn't expecting this. Well, that's what interruptions are all about, Jim. But I look to you because you're in charge. That's what an interruptible heart reacts to. Just saying. So next time you're irritated by an interruption, whether it's from people or from God, say, I think a divine moment is coming. I'll let this happen. And my plans are not that important. Another couple of questions I ask, and these are kind of analytical questions. And this one's actually pretty obvious. Even from this passage, I think the greatest surprise in this passage, the first time you ever read it, is the fact that God loves his enemies. Not only does God love his enemies, God puts his enemies to work for his glory, not their own glory. I think Paul was on the road to Damascus to arrest people for his own glory, not for God's glory. He was an up-and-coming, ambitious kind of religious guy. Yeah. So I think from the bottom line, and it's such a simple thing, to see God notice his enemy, because he notices his enemy, instead of taking his enemy and vaporizing him on the road to Damascus, which he could have done. He could have first warned him, Saul, light, on the ground, boom, Jesus whom you're persecuting. And by the way, you got 10 seconds to live. 10, 9, and he's gone. He's just a pile of dust on the ground. He could have done that. God did similar things in the Old Testament in some situations, not always. But here God says, I know who this guy is. And then he tells Ananias, this guy is not a big deal for me from the enemy list. And why? Because he's my chosen instrument. I know this guy all along. I know him really well. And we'll get back to that in a moment when I tell you one of my stories. Third question I asked in all of this, which I really liked, is, and the teens grabbed on this really well, is, so what do you think the best course in life is? The best course in life is whatever course God lays out, not that you lay out. And now many of us in frustration will say, well, I sure would like to know what that is. God's not being real forthcoming on that, But you can always by faith, you can always say, God, I want you, what your will is. I want your course to happen. I don't know what that is. You've clearly not shown that to me, and that's okay with me. I trust you. You love me. You're sovereign. You're in control. You got the power. I don't. You're wise. I'm not. So whatever we're going, God, I prefer what your course is. So this is what I call voluntary interruptions. Where you say, God, this is the direction I'm going. But here's the deal, God. This is a course that I charted. And it doesn't seem like it's a bad course, but it's my course after all, and I'm not as smart as you. So God, I voluntarily right now say, if you got a better idea or a better course, I'm totally open to it. I'm willing to be interrupted. Stop me on my way. Whatever we're doing, just do that. So I call that voluntary interruptions because God's not always forthcoming about what he wants to do with you. But for you to wake up and say, God, here's my plan. If you got a better idea, I'm all for it. I want yours to reign. Right. So the best course in life isn't necessarily the one you chart. It's the one that God charts. And that's always the case. So let me tell you a couple of stories about me where this happened. I'll tell you about two interruptions in my life. The later one I'll tell you first. And many of you know I used to work for HP. Worked for HP for 2 decades. And I was really busy with them, doing too much. I was doing too much. Wasn't seeing my kids hardly at all, but I was working really hard. So one time, Dorothy and I went to the beach in an Oregon beach at Cannon Beach. And Cannon Beach has this big rock out in the water called Haystack Rock. So one time we were there, we were in a little hotel room. I told Dorothy, look, I'm going to go out at night and just walk down the beach because I like to hear the sound of the surf in the dark. It's just really mysterious to me. And all I'm going to do, so she could call the police if I didn't come back. All I'm going to do is I'm going to go onto the sand right where our hotel room is. I'm going to walk down to Haystack Rock. It's like a mile and a half. Take me half an hour. I'll walk down to Haystack Rock. I'll turn around and come back, and then I'll be done. That's that. And there was nothing troubling me. I was horribly busy at HP at the time. I wasn't in full-time ministry. I was volunteering at church, but I was really busy. So this was just a great recreational release. So I left the hotel room. I walked across the dry sand that doesn't get wet during the day. It's really hard to walk. And then you get to the hard sand where there's water on it. And I hit that part of the sand and I turned south to go down to Haystack Rock. And within minutes of me turning south to go down to Haystack Rock, God stopped me by saying something. Did he really say anything? Could you hear him? People ask me all the time. No, I'm not sure I actually heard anything, but the message is very clear. So clear, in fact, that if I ignored what was happening at that moment, if I said, shh, stop that. If I ignored what was going on at that moment, I would someday face in front of God, and God would say, what part of that didn't you get? And I'd have to say, well, I got it. Well, then why did you ignore it? So it was a very clear thing. And what he said was, you're leaving HP and you're going into full-time ministry. After 20 years with HP, with the challenge at the time of creating $2 billion of new revenue for the company through the cell phones that were arising at the time. So that's all I had to do was just come up with $2 billion of revenue. So I told God, as I was walking down the Haystack Rock, I told God, hey, no, wait, look. This is really not a good idea. I have people relying on me at work. I'm doing big things, and and you made me like this. I'm really firing on all cylinders. I'm doing this great stuff, and you made me like this, so I want to engage in this. I'm enjoying it. I'm good at it. I'm making presentations to vice presidents and presidents of telecom companies in the country. I'm doing all this kind of stuff. It's not a pride thing, but the rubber hit the road. I was doing great stuff. So I said to God, look, I don't have time for that. I've got this thing I'm doing. Best course is God's course, not your own, but I made my case. So as we're walking down to Haystack Rock, he's silent. And I make over and over similar cases, Well, God, it's not right for me to leave them in the lurch. I understand what you're saying about full-time ministry, and I don't really resist that. But it's more kind of like a workload thing. I think I'm better at what I'm doing, and I'll volunteer at church. I make all this case for a half hour down the Haystack Rock. God says nothing. Nothing. And so I turn around to Haystack Rock and start coming back the half hour up the beach. And I continue my argument. So God, here's the deal. And I'm making all these arguments. This is just not a good idea. I think this is really a poor choice, God. I love volunteering at church. I was kind of subbing for the pastor from time to time. I was worship leading every morning in front of, 300 people. And so I was doing adult Sunday school. I was doing okay for Jesus. But making the switch to full-time ministry, I said, no, God, you don't understand. I can be effective in both places, and there are people counting me on HP, and this is the way I'm made. I get to the top of the beach where I have to come off the beach and head toward Dorothy. And I figured out, this is my last chance. I have to make my big case right here, because this is where I'm leaving the beach. He stopped me right here. I'm going to finish it right here. So I got to that very spot at the top of the beach before I headed up to Dorothy. And I said, okay, God, here's the deal. Here's the deal. This is my final case. Here's the deal. I am fundamentally an engineer. I am an engineer. I will always be an engineer. I love engineering. I'm effective at what I do in engineering. That's who I am. I am an engineer. And then God finally spoke and he said, you haven't got a clue who you are. How do you respond to that? Because he made you. He knows how you're made. You haven't got a clue who you are. I couldn't say anything. I was just stunned. I was just stunned. I lost the argument. Don't ever argue with God. You'll always lose. So then I walked off the beach. I went with Dorothy to the apartment, the hotel room. I opened the hotel room, and as soon as I showed my face in the hotel room, she looked at me and she said, have you been mugged? Because there was something. She could tell something had happened. And then flippantly I said, well, in a manner of speaking, I guess you could say I have been mugged. She said, what happened? Did someone take your wallet? No, God just changed the course of my life. I think, but I'm not sure. And I'm still wrestling with this. So we sat down, I shared with her, and we said, well, if this is what God wants, this is what God wants. But I don't know. I don't know. To do this full time. We had young kids in the house. I know that my income with HP was way too big. But now we're going to talk about something that was maybe a quarter or less of the income I had. I didn't know whether we could deal with that with 4 kids at home. I mean, a lot of practical things came up. But I kept telling Dorothy, but this is who I am. I'm an engineer and I love doing it. And God made me this way. It's his fault. You got to be careful when you do these kind of things. Anyway, so we both accepted it. I said, I don't know. I don't know what the plans are. I don't know where the course is. I don't know the tracks are. I don't know any of this kind of stuff. And so then a little while, we left there, came back home. Some months transpired. I didn't know what that meant, kind of as a way of God saying, I want you to get used to this idea. So nothing transpired for a while. It went on for about a year where nothing transpired. I said, God, I don't know what the deal is. I'm open to this, but I don't know how it's going to happen. Do you want me to go to seminary? I mean, I don't know what to do next. And so then I did a Gideon thing, and I did a fleece. You heard about Gideon and Judges. So Gideon's not sure that God's leading is solid, so he does a fleece thing. Make the fleece wet when the ground is dry, and let's do another one. Let's make it the other way around. So I said, let's make a fleece. So I said to God, okay, here's the deal. I got to come up with the hardest thing ever. The hardest thing ever. And if God does it, there won't be any doubt. So I said to God, okay, I got it. This is what we're going to do, God. I am so busy with so many things at HP. Running billion-dollar programs, working for 4 vice presidents simultaneously, never worked for more than one boss. I said, so here's the deal, God. If there's a day that I come into work and I have nothing to do, then I'll consider that a sign. That's my fleece. Now, I laughed when I said that because that was so inconceivable to me. I thought that's just never going to happen. Well, a year went on, nothing. Another year went on, and at the end of that third year after he confronted me on the beach, I come back from a long business trip from Europe. I'm sitting at my desk on a Monday morning. My boss saunters into my office, sits across from me in my office, has this weird look on his face. And he says, I've never had to do this before. I thought I was going to be fired. I've never had to do this before, but he says, it's a little embarrassing for me too, but since you were gone on that long trip, we did some reorganizations, some strategic moves, blah, 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 corporate speak. And he said, so I'm embarrassed. I have nothing for you to do right now. Ding. And he said, why are you looking at me like that? I said, well, you don't understand. This has been an answer to prayer. What? That I would have nothing for you to do right now? I said, well, and I explained it as good as I could. He wasn't a believer. He didn't really catch it. But that day I wrote up my letter and said, I'm leaving. In about 3 months, at the end of the year, I'm going to be gone. What? What? And so that's what I did. And 3 months after that, I started working at our local church full time. At the same time, it turns out an opening had opened up at our church. I was one of the leaders of the church. We're trying to find someone to fill the hole. And exactly at the same time, almost exactly the same time, we had an elders meeting one day. I'm sitting there as one of the elders in the church, and the other guys are there. The senior pastor's sitting next to me. He said, boy, this is really hard to fill in this hole of this guy that we let go. It'd be nice to get someone who does more than just youth. It'd be nice to have someone who does maybe some music stuff and can teach a little bit. And he's going down this list of things that I've been doing for years. And then jokingly, he turns to me, puts his hand on my shoulder and says, yeah, like someone like Jim. And at that point, they hadn't heard about my thing at HP. And I said, well, it's funny you should mention that because I just quit last week. What? There's much more to that story. But that was really an interruptible moment that I fought. And I think Paul saw, he fought it as well. Because he knew who he was. I knew who I was. I knew what I was doing. I was doing good things for God too. I mean, everything was just cooking until God stops Paul and God stops me and says, that's it. We're going another course. So is it going to be your will or my will that wins, God says. And Paul said, your will. And I said, your will. And I told you I'd tell two stories. This is much shorter. The first time God did this to me is when I became a believer. And I've told this story before. I was 15 years old, and I was sitting at the end of my bed. It was January 1st. It was right after New Year's, the New Year's Eve thing had happened. The ball came down in Times Square, all that kind of jazz. And I'm sitting on the end of my bed, getting ready to go to bed, and I decided to just look out my window at the end of my bed and just look at the stars. Brilliantly black sky with all these stars. It's just really wonderful, and I've loved looking at stars. And I'm just sitting there looking at the stars. Nothing's troubling me. And then all of a sudden, God interrupts. Be careful when you look at the stars. God can interrupt. So he interrupts me and he says, did you hear him, Jim? Was it audible? No, stop asking that question. I know I got the message. And the message was very simply, you're at a fork in the road, Jim. You can either go your way or my way. So which way you want to go? I said, what? Now, I wasn't a fork in the road because that was the year going from 1969 to 1970. The 60s were going into the 70s. And I was thinking about the 70s, and I was thinking about the fact that, by the end of the 70s, I'll probably maybe have a college degree if I'm lucky. I may be married, might even have kids. I don't know, I mean, it was going to be a big time, but it was a change from the 60s to the 70s. It was a big change. So basically, I was thinking about where's my life going to go, and then God pops in and interrupts and says, you can go my way or you can go your way. So what do you want to do? My way, your way. What do you want to do? And in that moment, I'm sitting there, and it's not troubling at all. It's not like the bigger interruptions. I thought about it for a while, and I thought just enough about who God was and the fact that he knows me probably better than I know myself. And as a 15-year-old, your ability to chart the future is very poor, and you know it. You know it. In fact, it scares you to death. Where am I going in life? That uncertainty when you're in your teens and you're not out of the house, it's like, where am I going? What's going to happen to me? All that kind of uncertainty. So I looked at that and very simply in this interruption, I said, well, God, I think you love me maybe more than I love myself. You're clearly more skilled at charting courses that'll fulfill me. So I just said, okay, your way. That's all I said. And here, 57 years later, it stuck. It stuck. Now, before I left that evening and went to bed, as I was going to bed, I'm thinking, oh no, well, wait a second. Let me think about this for a second. I said yes to God, but so I added a PS prayer after that as I was going to bed. I said, well, look, God, I know I said yes, and I know I'll let you take control of this guy. I want your will to be done. All that kind of stuff. But if this has anything to do with like going to New Guinea and being a missionary, I'm not good at that. So it's okay. I started putting conditions on it. If we don't go to New Guinea, I'll be fine. And then the other one, which I've told you before, I said, and the other thing too is if I'm yours fully, and you want me to talk to people, I can't do that. Either singly or in groups. I don't do that. I would throw up consistently when I even contemplated talking to another individual at 15. I was very shy. But the whole concept of actually standing up in front of people, I would have convulsed and died if he showed me that. Which is why God doesn't always unveil your future, because you can't handle the truth. So I told him, if it's going to involve all that kind of stuff, I just want to let you know, God, that I'm not in that plan, whatever your plan is. It can't be that part of it. There was no response from God during all of that discussion, but I think there was some chuckling in heaven. Oh, you just wait. And you know what? In the same kind of way at that point, God could have said, you don't really know who you are. You don't know about the abilities I've given you that are latent in terms of speaking or teaching or playing guitar. And you don't know any of that stuff. You don't know who you are. And now you're praying to me saying, maybe I want to renege on the deal because this is who I am. I can't speak and I can't do stuff. God says, no. So in those two interruptions in life, God changed the entire course of my life. So if your heart is ready to be interrupted, if your heart is ready to let go of your way and your course, if your heart is saying to God, God, interrupt me. I'm willing to be interrupted. And I'll tell you this, and this is what I told the youth this week too, because this is a big deal with youth. Because of that uncertainty about the future, because of knowing that you can't control the future, and yet you wonder how you'll get to be in a place in life that'll be fulfilling and good. How do I get to that good place in life? That's what they want. That's what they want. And so I had to tell them, look, I know that you're confused and you're actually anxious because you can't control the future and things are changing so fast. And what is this world like? I said, you just need to start practicing right now and say, God, I can't chart a good path because I'm 15 years old. But I trust that you love me. I'm inviting you to interrupt the course of my life. Now, that was also a coded word of saying, if you haven't given your life to Jesus, that's how you give your life to Jesus. My course in life has been a wasteland. My future course, I don't think I'm going to do any better. Maybe what I need to do right now is say, God, I'm ready to be interrupted. I'm ready to be interrupted. And then I started to hear crying there. I heard crying amongst the kids. I want to be interrupted, God, because where I am, I'm not satisfied with. And where I want to go, I don't know how to do. So they started crying. It was a pretty heavy night. It's a pretty heavy night. And I had to reassure them that when you give your life to Jesus, it's a voluntary interruption. God, I'm voluntarily asking you to interrupt the course of my life. I'm yours. I want your will to be done, not mine. Not mine. So that was a pretty heavy night. Let me just wrap this up by a couple of passages because these are really powerful. James writes in James 4 about, the fact that we chart our courses in life, thinking we're going to get somewhere when we chart our courses in life. And he jumps in James 4. Come now, you who say, oh, today or tomorrow, we'll go into such and such a town, spend a year there, trade and make a profit. 4:14. Yet you don't know what tomorrow will bring. This is the powerless 15-year-old. You don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. What is your life? Hey, you're a mist. You're just a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say this, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. That's an interruptible life right there. Whatever the Lord wills, that's what I want. Another great place in Jeremiah 10. Oh, I just love this passage. This again is the 15-year-old insecure, can't chart my future because I know I'm ignorant and not wise, and my judgment's poor. Nice realistic take on your future. Jeremiah 10:23. I know, Lord, that the way of a man is not in himself. It's not in man who walks to direct his steps. It's an inability to be able to chart that course. And then he asks God, this is a voluntary interruption. So God, I'm asking you to interrupt me. Here we go. This is how he says it. Correct me, O Lord, but in justice. Do it right, and not in your anger, lest you bring me to nothing. So it's a voluntary plea to be interrupted. Correct me, O Lord, but do it justly. Do it in a way that's right. That's right. Yeah. Psalm 31, verse 3. It's a great psalm. It's going to make me cry. I'm stopping myself. Here we go. For you are my rock and my fortress, and for your name's sake, you lead me and guide me. Which brings up a whole new aspect of the fact of being interruptible. It's not interruptible just to make your life fulfilled. It's interruptible that for his name's sake, so he will be glorified. God, glorify yourself in this next interruption of my life. Whether it be a sudden physical illness, whether it be a loss of house or home or money, whatever the loss might be, God, for your name's sake, lead me. Or I could translate that, for your name's sake, interrupt me. It's an intention to be a glory to who God is. Proverbs 16. And this, by the way, this whole idea of interruptibility in God's will is everywhere. Proverbs 16:9. The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Man, it's much more powerful. And then I'll close with this. This is a song that Dorothy and I used to sing when we were in a singing group. It's from Psalm 37. The steps of a man are established by the Lord, and he delights in his way. And though he fall, he shall not be cast headlong, for the Lord is the one who holds his hand. So even when we commit ourselves to the path that God has for us, there's going to be trips and falls. There's going to be troubles. There's just going to be. But the issue is that he says that in that entire process where God establishes our steps, if we trip, if we fall, you won't be cast headlong. You won't do a face plant. And why? Because the Lord has our hand. The Lord has our hand. So the question at the end of the day really is, are you interruptible? Are you welcoming being interrupted by God? Right? Are you saying to God, God, interrupt me. This is my plan right here. I don't know. I do this all the time when I do big plans for things. For instance, when we moved from Spokane to Brigham City 23 years ago now. Yeah, 22 years ago. The prospect of coming here was laid there. It looked like a possibility, but I wasn't getting any, flaming angels with a sword at the end of my bed telling me go there or die. That would have been easier, Okay, no light that cast me to the ground and a voice from heaven saying, this is Jesus. None of that kind of stuff. So there was just sitting there as an option. And this is what I prayed, and I do this all the time. I just do it all the time when there's big changes or even little changes in my life. I pray this way, and I say, well, God, here's my best idea what to do next. And my best idea what's coming here. Here's my best idea. And if this is wrong, will you interrupt me? It's a really practical way to invite God's will into what you're doing. God, this is the best I got. But I'm still a 15-year-old who's very bad at long-term planning. and the repercussions of coming here with 2 kids still at home, the whole 9 yards. So God, this is the best I got. But if you got a better idea, I'm all up for that. I'm interruptible. But this is the direction I'm going to go until you stop me. That's actually a very biblical way to kind of chart out your path in life. I want to be interrupted by God. I'll still have to hack through a path. God puts me in the place of training me about how to think biblically, how to think godly. I mean, he actually puts decisions in front of you, so he changes who you are as you wrestle over them. And in the end, when you come up with a plan, you go, oh, looks best to me. So God, if you got a better idea, just interrupt me. Well, in that particular case, he didn't interrupt me. He did not interrupt me. So here we are. So God's sovereign. He's sovereign over the course of your life. Just make sure your heart is soft enough so that when you get stopped on a road to Damascus, you can say, oh, that's different. I'm all for what you want, God. Here we go. That's an interruptible heart that prefers the will of God over your own will. That's just such an important life skill. And that's what, as I was working on this since March, I was going, I don't think I'm really interruptible. I'm irritated when I'm interrupted. But over the last several months, God says, no, you're interruptible. And he just brought a wave of examples of things in the past. He says, no, you're interruptible, but just quit complaining and go with my program. Just go with my program. Okay. Well, why don't we stand and we'll be dismissed and we'll be out of here. Father in heaven, we thank you that you are sovereign, you are in charge, and that your love for us is everlasting, never stops. And even as our circumstances tend to tempt us to think that you've forgotten about us or that you've gone off in some other corner of the universe or bad things are happening, so God must not care. When we're tempted to think that way, God, I pray that you would give us an assurance of the fact that you are always in control, have never stopped being in control. And that even when circumstances have no appearance of being good for us, kind of Job-like, have no appearance of being good for us, we can still rest, sit back in our chairs and say, well, this is not what I was expecting. But God's sovereign. God loves me. And I want to be interrupted by him because he is good. I give thanks to the Lord for he is good. And his loving kindness for me never stops. So, Father, we thank you that you called us to yourself. We thank you that you interrupted the course of our lives when we gave our lives to you. And we thank you that you continue to interrupt the course of our lives in order to satisfy your will and to glorify who you are in the process. Interrupt us more, we pray, God. Interrupt us more. So we thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.